All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. We're looking at one of the absolutely most devastating natural disasters in modern Indian history. Today, we're unpacking the official Joint Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment Report to figure out exactly what happened during the 2013 Uttarakhand floods. We're going to break down the entire anatomy of this disaster, look at the immediate response, and try to wrap our heads around the massive undertaking of rebuilding a totally shattered state.
Now, the sheer, unimaginable scale of these June 2013 flash floods, it's just hard to process. Entire communities up in the Himalayas were completely, instantly isolated. Just look at the people right here, stranded, staring across this incredibly violent, raging river. The data tells us that over 900,000 people were ultimately affected by this one single event. You know, it really wasn't just a local flood. This was a massive regional catastrophe that literally wiped away towns, roads, and livelihoods in the blink of an eye.
So that begs the ultimate question we're exploring today. How in the world does a government assess, let alone recover from, a disaster that wipes out vital infrastructure in a matter of days? Seriously, when entire mountainsides just give way and rivers literally carve brand new paths right through populated valleys, where do you even begin? How do you calculate that cost and mobilize a recovery?
Section 1. The Perfect Storm, Geography and the June 2013 Trigger. Let's see how the state's varied geography combined with a total freak weather system to trigger this catastrophe.
So take a look at the high-risk seismic zones highlighted on this map. Uttarakhand is overwhelmingly mountainous. Actually, a full 90% of its total geographical area is hilly terrain. But it gets even more complicated than just steep hills. The entire state falls into high-risk seismic zones, specifically zones 4 and 5. What does that mean? Well, it means the land itself is naturally fragile and just incredibly prone to extreme events, things like rockfalls and landslides. The very foundation of the state is structurally vulnerable to the forces of nature.
And man, this crisis escalated rapidly. In mid-June, the monsoon arrives almost 2 full weeks earlier than anyone expected. Then, from June 15th to the 17th, these completely unprecedented heavy rainfalls and cloudbursts just battered the higher reaches. To put it in perspective, the Wadia Institute recorded a staggering 115 millimeters of rain in just 12 hours on June 16th. That immense pressure caused the weak moraine barrier of the Chorabari Glacier Lake to burst, sending this catastrophic wall of water and massive glacial boulders just rushing downstream.
The resulting floodwaters completely and utterly devastated the Kedarnath Valley. This photograph is honestly just haunting. You can see the historic Kedarnath Temple is miraculously still standing, sure, but it is entirely surrounded by massive boulders, deep mud, and just the total ruins of destroyed buildings. And making matters infinitely worse, all of this happened during the peak summer pilgrimage season. Tragically, official reports confirm that 580 human lives were lost and over 5,400 people were reported missing in the absolute chaos. Moving on to Section 2. Chaos and Rescue. Mobilizing a massive response. The crucial point here is exactly how authorities responded to tens of thousands of stranded tourists, pilgrims, and locals in a terrain that essentially just lost all its roads. I mean, the logistics of this rescue were just mind-boggling. Despite actively hostile weather, super dense clouds, and practically non-existent roads, a massive operation was launched. Through some incredible coordination of air and ground assets, rescue teams somehow successfully evacuated over 110,000 people. And this wasn't a solo effort by any stretch of the imagination. It took a highly coordinated multi-agency response. We're talking the Indian Air Force, the Indian Army, the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, the National Disaster Response Force, and local police, all deploying at the exact same time. They had to manage an absolute logistical nightmare in a mountainous terrain where traditional supply lines had literally just washed away.
Operating on treacherous, incredibly dangerous cliff edges like this one, the Air Force and civilian helicopters flew over 4,600 sorties. 4,600! They were dropping vital relief materials to entirely cut off communities and physically airlifting stranded people right out of those high mountain passes. It went down as one of the largest evacuation operations in the nation's entire history.
But, beyond the incredible military machinery, we absolutely have to remember the human element, which is captured so vividly right here. These are local citizens coming together, working with whatever makeshift tools they had, literally pulling survivors from the mud and rubble. It was a grassroots community survival effort, just as much as it was a massive state-sponsored rescue.
All right, Section 3, a shattered infrastructure, translating the impact. Now we're going to zoom in on what the floodwaters left behind once they finally receded and translate these incredible physical losses into hard data.
So, the surging rivers eroded the very bases of the mountains themselves. This toe erosion caused catastrophic landslides, taking out entire settlements, snapping bridges, you name it. Over 3,000 housing units were partially or completely wiped out. Just look at how these houses are left hanging precariously on slopes that simply gave way right beneath them. It's terrifying.
Now, breaking down the housing data, we see a really clear divide. While 669 urban units were impacted, the rural areas absolutely bore the brunt of the structural destruction, with 2,408 units affected. And out of those, a staggering 1,647 rural homes were completely destroyed. The calculated need for housing reconstruction and relocation alone, that came to over 1.5 billion rupees.
And the massive debris you're seeing here explains exactly why it was so incredibly difficult to reach those rural communities to provide any sort of relief. Vital connectivity was entirely severed. Major district roads, state highways, tiny village paths, they were all completely engulfed by boulders and debris, crushing vehicles and just halting all movement dead in its tracks.
Which brings us to Section 4, the economic toll, counting the financial cost. Let's step back a bit and look at the macro view, the raw financial reality of this joint rapid damage and needs assessment. When the government, alongside the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, finally crunched all the numbers, the preliminary estimate was a staggering 39.64 billion rupees. Just to put that into perspective, at the time of the report, that was roughly equivalent to 661 million US dollars, and that's the money needed just to reconstruct the state. When we break down exactly where that massive sum of money needed to go, the priorities become crystal clear. Roads and bridges absolutely dominated the budget, requiring an estimated 27.1 billion rupees. I mean, you simply cannot rebuild a state if you physically cannot travel through it, right? This was followed by 2.6 billion for the power grid and energy sector, and then 1.6 billion just to try and restore agricultural and tourism livelihoods.
Honestly, seeing entire blocks of urban infrastructure, we're talking multi-story concrete buildings here, violently collapsing into raging river currents, makes that massive 40 billion rupee price tag horrifyingly easy to understand. The water didn't just flood these towns, it physically erased the very land they were built upon.
Finally, Section 5, Promises for the Future, Building Back Smarter. Let's examine how this immense tragedy was actually supposed to shape the future of disaster management in the state.
So this official assessment report wasn't just a giant bill for damages. It was really framed as a turning point. It was introduced with a very strong, explicit commitment from the Chief Minister to, quote, build back smarter, to improve resilience. The whole goal was to heavily utilize science, satellite data, and crucially, new early warning systems to ensure that a disaster of this scale would never, ever claim so many lives again.
But if you look closely at the news records years later, we find a pretty jarring contrast. According to disaster risk reduction trackers, 8 full years after these earnest promises were made, the state had still failed to deliver that vital, fully functional early warning system. That big commitment to integrate science to warn citizens of impending cloudbursts and rising rivers, it seemingly just stalled out in the face of implementation.
And that leaves us with a pretty haunting realization to ponder as we wrap up this explainer. We have the technology, and as we've seen today, we definitely have the data to understand the exact anatomy of a disaster. But if we fail to actually implement the very systems designed to save us, why do we let history repeat itself? Thank you so much for exploring this data with me today. It's just incredibly important we understand these events, not just as tragedies, but as vital, vital lessons for our future.